The howls pierced the morning air like broken glass, stopping Frank Miller mid-stride on the forest trail, his hiking boots frozen against the pine-needled ground. His weathered hand gripped the walking stick until his knuckles turned white. This wasn't the sound of a dog in distress. This was the sound of a mother fighting for her life. Martha Henderson dropped her water bottle, the metallic clang echoing through the Cascade Forest as 6 pairs of elderly eyes locked onto the desperate cries coming from the ravine below. Through the morning mist, they glimpsed something that made their blood run cold. 12 feet of muscle and scales wrapped around a German shepherd's hindquarters, while 3 tiny puppies cowered behind a fallen log. Frank's military training kicked in despite his 68 years, memories of Margaret flooding back, how she'd always said animals choose their protectors for a reason. The dog's amber eyes met his across the clearing, and in that moment he saw something that would haunt him forever. Absolute trust. "Dear God," Martha whispered, "she's not running. She's protecting them." What happened next would shatter everything they thought they knew about loyalty and uncover secrets that had been buried in these woods for decades. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 weeks earlier, Frank Miller had been a man drowning in silence. The empty house on Maple Street echoed with 43 years of memories, each creak of the floorboards a reminder that Margaret would never again call his name from the kitchen. The medical bills sat in neat stacks on her old desk, $40,000 in debt from a battle they'd fought together and lost alone. Some mornings, Frank wondered if joining her might be easier than facing another day without her laugh filling the rooms they'd shared since 1979. Martha Henderson had watched her neighbor's decline with the keen eye of a retired teacher who'd spent 30 years recognizing when a child was struggling. At 65, she possessed the gentle persistence that had made her beloved by generations of students. When she'd knocked on Frank's door that first Tuesday morning with hiking boots in hand, he'd tried to refuse. "Fresh air never killed anybody, Frank Miller," she'd said with the authority of someone who'd corralled teenagers for 3 decades. "But sitting in that house might." The Cascade Forest hiking group had started as Martha's intervention disguise. 6 community members, all past retirement, all carrying their own burdens in the post-logging economy that had left their small Oregon town gasping for purpose. There was Bill Thompson, the former mill foreman whose pension had been cut in half, Dorothy Chen, widowed and struggling with her son's addiction, and the others who'd found solace in Martha's Tuesday morning ritual of forcing them all to remember they were still alive. Dr. Sarah Mitchell represented the younger generation trying to hold their community together. At 45, she'd returned to her hometown after her Portland practice failed, inheriting her father's veterinary clinic along with its mounting debts. The foreclosure notice had arrived last month, 90 days to find $35,000 or lose everything her family had built. She'd grown up knowing every animal in 3 counties. And now she was watching the place that had shaped her slip away, one unpaid bill at a time. Hidden in the deeper shadows of the forest, Dr. Marcus Richardson observed it all through expensive binoculars. 52 years old, with graying temples and haunted eyes, he'd been camping in the area for 2 months under the pretense of wildlife research. His real purpose was darker. The disgraced archaeologist had been following rumors of Spanish colonial artifacts for years, believing that one big discovery could restore everything he'd lost. His daughter Emma hadn't spoken to him in 5 years, not since his obsession with fixing the past had destroyed their family. The divorce papers had cited abandonment, but Marcus knew the truth was worse. He'd chosen his archaeological fantasies over the people who'd needed him most. None of them knew how their lives were about to intertwine around a German shepherd who'd been living wild in these woods for reasons no one understood. Bella had been watching them too, her intelligent amber eyes tracking their weekly hikes, her maternal instincts somehow recognizing that these broken humans might be exactly what she'd been waiting for. The forest held its breath, preparing to reveal its secrets. The morning air hung thick with Oregon mist, as Frank Miller led the hiking group deeper into Cascade Forest than they'd ventured before. His compass pointed northeast, toward the old ranger stations that had been abandoned since budget cuts claimed another piece of their community's infrastructure. Martha walked beside him, her teacher's instincts noting how his shoulders had straightened over these past weeks, the first sign of healing she'd witnessed since Margaret's funeral. "Listen," Dorothy Chen whispered, raising her weathered hand. The group of 6 stopped, their breathing creating small clouds in the crisp September air. At first, there was only the whisper of wind through Douglas fir branches. Then it came again, a sound that made Frank's military-trained spine stiffen with recognition. Those weren't ordinary dog whines. This was primal terror. Bill Thompson, despite his 72 years, moved with surprising agility as the group descended toward the ravine where the cries originated. What they discovered made Martha's teaching experience, 30 years of scraped knees and playground accidents, seem like preparation for this moment of absolute horror. The Burmese python stretched nearly 12 feet, its muscular coils wrapped around the hindquarters of a German shepherd whose amber eyes blazed with desperate maternal fury. 3 puppies, no more than 8 weeks old, pressed themselves against a moss-covered log, their tiny bodies trembling with terror. The mother dog's front paws dug frantically into the forest floor, her powerful jaws snapping at the serpent's head, while her back legs were slowly being crushed. "Jesus Christ," Frank breathed, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd seen combat in Vietnam. But this wasn't Southeast Asia. This was home, and something was terribly wrong. Burmese pythons didn't belong in Oregon forests. Martha's mind raced with the precision that had made her an exceptional teacher. "Bill, get behind the snake's head with your walking stick. Dorothy, you and I will distract it from the left. Frank, can you—" "I've got the dog," Frank interrupted, already moving. The military training that had lain dormant for 50 years surged through his aging muscles. Margaret had always said he'd been born to protect things, first his country, then her, now this. The battle lasted 8 minutes that felt like hours. The python's prehistoric strength was overwhelming, but it hadn't counted on the combined determination of 6 senior citizens who'd survived decades of life's hardships. Bill's walking stick jabbed at pressure points he'd learned about in his mill safety training. Martha coordinated their movements with the same authority she'd used to direct Christmas pageants. Dorothy, despite her small frame, wielded her hiking pole with surprising effectiveness. Frank focused entirely on the dog. Bella, he found himself thinking, though he didn't know where the name came from. Her eyes met his across the coils of scale and muscle, and something passed between them that transcended species. Recognition, trust, a shared understanding of what it meant to fight for someone you loved. When the python finally released its grip and slithered away into the underbrush, Bella collapsed against Frank's chest, her breathing labored, but her eyes still fierce with protective instinct. Blood seeped from puncture wounds where the constrictor's teeth had found their mark, but she refused to leave her puppy's side. "Call Dr. Mitchell," Martha commanded, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "Tell her it's an emergency." As Frank cradled the injured dog, he noticed details that his trained eye couldn't ignore. This wasn't a wild animal. Bella's muscle tone, her instant response to human commands, the way she'd positioned herself tactically to protect her young. Someone had trained this dog and trained her well. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived within 20 minutes, her emergency bag in hand and her face pale with concern. As she examined Bella's wounds, her experienced fingers found something that made her pause. "This is interesting," she murmured, running her hand along the dog's neck. "There's scar tissue here, surgical, not accidental, and her coat condition. She hasn't been wild for long." The puppies had emerged from hiding, pressing against their mother with tiny whimpers of relief. Frank found himself transfixed by their vulnerability, remembering how Margaret had always wanted children, how they'd mourned together when the doctors said it would never happen. "She'll need surgery for the internal injuries," Dr. Mitchell explained, "but she's strong." The real question is what a trained dog like this was doing out here alone. As they carefully transported Bella and her puppies to the clinic, none of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line. Dr. Marcus Richardson lowered his binoculars, a cold smile playing at his lips. Things had just become much more interesting. The hikers had found his guardian. Now he just needed to guide them to what she was guarding. The game had begun. Bella's recovery over the next 4 days defied every expectation Dr. Sarah Mitchell had formed in 20 years of veterinary practice. The German Shepherd's wounds healed with remarkable speed, but more striking was her behavior, intelligent, purposeful, almost human in her determination to communicate something urgent to her rescuers. Frank found himself at the clinic every morning by 7, drawn by a connection he couldn't explain. As he sat with Bella, stroking her healing coat while her puppies nursed, memories of Margaret flooded back, not the painful hospital scenes that had haunted him for months, but earlier times when his wife would rescue injured birds and nurse them back to health in their kitchen. "She keeps looking toward the door," Martha observed on the 3rd day, settling into the worn chair beside Frank. "Like she's waiting for something." Dr. Mitchell nodded, checking Bella's surgical site. "Her vitals are perfect, but there's definitely something on her mind. Yesterday she actually tried to lead me outside twice. I've never seen behavior quite like it." On the 5th day, Bella made her intentions unmistakably clear. The moment Frank entered the clinic, she stood with surprising steadiness, walked to the door, and looked back at him with those intelligent amber eyes. When he didn't immediately follow, she returned, gently took his sleeve in her mouth, and pulled. "I think she wants to show us something," Frank said, feeling foolish for talking about a dog as if she were a tour guide. Martha's teacher instincts kicked in. "Well, what's the worst that could happen? We follow her for a little while, see what she's after." Dr. Mitchell hesitated, her practical nature warring with curiosity. "She's not fully healed. If we're going to do this, it needs to be a short walk." The hiking group reassembled that afternoon with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Bill Thompson grumbled about chasing after a mutt's wild ideas, but his eyes betrayed interest. Dorothy Chen brought her camera, sensing they might witness something worth documenting. Bella led them with the confidence of someone returning home after a long absence. Her path through the forest was deliberate, avoiding the rougher terrain that might challenge the elderly hikers while maintaining a direct course toward something only she could sense. 20 minutes into their trek, she stopped beside a cluster of ancient Douglas firs, their trunks scarred by decades of weather and wildlife. At first, the group saw nothing unusual, just forest floor covered in the typical carpet of pine needles and fallen branches. Then Frank's military-trained eyes caught what the others had missed. "There," he said, pointing to a depression in the earth partially hidden by overgrown ferns. "Something's buried there." Martha knelt carefully, her arthritic knees protesting, and began brushing away decades of accumulated forest debris. Her fingers encountered something hard, geometric, definitely not natural. "Dear God," she whispered, as the carved edges of a stone artifact emerged from the earth. The object was roughly the size of a dinner plate, intricately carved with symbols that none of them recognized. Despite its age, the craftsmanship was extraordinary. This was no crude frontier relic. Dr. Mitchell's eyes widened as she examined the find. This could be significant, really significant. We need to document everything before we move it. Dorothy's camera clicked steadily as they carefully excavated the artifact. The stone was heavier than expected, carved from what appeared to be local granite, but worked with skills that suggested advanced knowledge of stonecraft. Bill Thompson, his former mill foreman's eye for detail engaged, noticed something else. "Look at the trees," he said, pointing upward. "See those markings on the bark? They're not natural. Someone's been marking these trees for years." The markings were subtle, small carved symbols that could easily be mistaken for animal scratches or natural scarring, but arranged in a deliberate pattern that led deeper into the forest. Frank felt something shift in his chest, the first genuine excitement he'd experienced since Margaret's diagnosis. His wife had been fascinated by local history, spending hours at the County Historical Society researching the early settlers and indigenous peoples of their region. She would have been thrilled by this discovery. "We should report this to the authorities," Martha said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Historical finds are supposed to be reported to the state." "And then what?" Dr. Mitchell asked quietly. "They'll cordon off the area, bring in university teams, and we'll never know what Bella was trying to show us. Plus, given the budget cuts, it could be months before anyone actually investigates." The group fell silent, each wrestling with the implications. They were law-abiding citizens who'd never considered keeping such a discovery secret. But they were also people who'd watched their community stripped of resources, their local institutions closed or defunded, their voices ignored by distant bureaucrats. Bella seemed to sense their hesitation. She walked to Frank, sat at his feet, and placed one paw on his knee, a gesture so human-like in its reassurance that it took his breath away. "She's not done," Frank said, certainty growing in his voice. "This isn't what she really wanted to show us. This is just the beginning." As if confirming his words, Bella stood and walked a few steps deeper into the forest, then looked back expectantly. Dr. Mitchell made the decision for all of them. "One more site. We follow her to one more location, document everything carefully, and then we decide as a group what to do." None of them noticed the figure watching from behind a massive cedar tree or the expensive camera with telephoto lens recording their every move. Dr. Marcus Richardson smiled to himself as he watched the elderly hikers debate their next move. Perfect. They were doing exactly what he'd hoped when he'd placed that first artifact 3 weeks ago. The bait had been taken. Now he just needed to guide them to the real prize and convince them they could trust him when the time came to make their choice. Over the following 3 weeks, what began as a simple mystery evolved into something that consumed the hiking group's every waking thought. Bella, now fully recovered and accompanied by her 3 growing puppies, led them on increasingly elaborate expeditions through the deepest sections of Cascade Forest. Each discovery was more remarkable than the last. Carved stones bearing intricate symbols, fragments of what appeared to be precious metals, and pieces of jewelry that gleamed despite decades buried in Oregon soil. Frank found himself transformed by the adventure. The man who had spent 6 months shuffling through his empty house in slippers now rose each morning with purpose, carefully packing hiking gear and checking weather reports with the precision of his old military days. The medical bills still sat on Margaret's desk, but for the first time since her death, they weren't the first thing he thought about when he opened his eyes. "You look 10 years younger," Martha observed on a Thursday morning as they prepared for another expedition. She'd watched Frank's gradual transformation with the satisfaction of a teacher seeing a struggling student finally grasp a difficult concept. The defeated man who'd barely spoken at Margaret's funeral was becoming someone she recognized, the Frank Miller her late husband had described from their bowling league days, full of stories and gentle humor. Dr. Sarah Mitchell found herself caught between professional excitement and growing ethical concern. Each artifact they uncovered clearly had significant historical value, and her scientific training demanded proper documentation and reporting. But the foreclosure notice on her clinic provided a constant reminder of practical realities. The latest discovery, a carved jade pendant that Bella had led them to beneath a lightning-struck oak, could potentially be worth thousands of dollars to the right collector. "I've been doing research," she told the group during one of their evening meetings at Frank's house. The living room that had been silent for months now buzzed with conversation as maps and photographs covered Margaret's coffee table. "These symbols don't match any known Pacific Northwest indigenous patterns. If anything, they look more like, well, like Spanish colonial markings." Bill Thompson, whose mill experience had given him an eye for valuable materials, examined the jade pendant under Frank's desk lamp. "My grandfather worked in mining before the timber industry took over. This isn't local stone. Someone brought this from a long way off." The financial pressures weighing on each group member added urgency to their discoveries. Dorothy Chen's son had entered another rehabilitation program, this one costing $15,000 that she didn't have. Bill Thompson's pension had been cut again, forcing him to choose between prescription medications and home heating. The entire community seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next economic blow. It was during their 4th week of exploration that Dr. Marcus Richardson made his carefully planned entrance into their lives. The group had just uncovered their most significant find yet, a small chest containing what appeared to be Spanish silver coins, when a voice called out from the tree line. "Fascinating work you're doing there," Richardson said, emerging from behind a cluster of young maples with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to academic authority. He was well dressed for forest hiking, his gear expensive but worn, suggesting genuine field experience. "I'm Dr. Marcus Richardson, independent archaeologist. I've been documenting wildlife patterns in this area for the past couple months." Frank's military instincts immediately assessed the newcomer. Mid-50s, intelligent eyes, slight academic stoop, but generally fit. There was something about Richardson's approach that felt rehearsed, but his credentials seemed legitimate when he produced a university ID and several published papers on Pacific Northwest archaeology. "You've stumbled onto something quite remarkable," Richardson continued, examining their latest find with professional interest. "These appear to be genuine 17th century Spanish colonial artifacts, extremely rare in this region." Dr. Mitchell felt a mix of relief and apprehension at finally having an expert's opinion. "We've been documenting everything, taking photographs, GPS coordinates, but we weren't sure about the proper protocol for reporting finds of this significance." Richardson nodded approvingly. "Very wise approach. The bureaucratic process for archaeological finds can be complicated, especially given current state budget constraints. I'd be happy to help authenticate your discoveries and advise on the best way forward." Over the following days, Richardson integrated himself smoothly into the group dynamic. He brought sophisticated testing equipment, confirmed the authenticity of their finds, and shared fascinating historical context about Spanish exploration of the Pacific coast. His knowledge was impressive, his manner warm and encouraging. "What you've discovered here could rewrite regional history," he told them during an evening session at Frank's house. "Spanish expeditions reached much farther north than most historians believed. These artifacts suggest a significant presence in this area, possibly even a temporary settlement." The value estimates he provided made their heads spin. The jade pendant alone might be worth $8,000 to $12,000. The silver coins could bring $15,000 to $20,000 from collectors who appreciated their historical significance. The carved stones, if properly documented and authenticated, might command even higher prices from museums or private collectors. Of course, Richardson added carefully, the legal situation is complex. Technically, fines on public land belong to the state, but the bureaucratic process can take years, and there's no guarantee of compensation for the discoverers. I've seen important archaeological sites tied up in red tape for decades. Frank felt Margaret's presence strongly during these discussions. His wife had always believed that important discoveries should benefit the people who made them, not disappear into government warehouses. She'd often criticized how bureaucracy stifled individual initiative and community benefit. Bella seemed to sense the growing tension within the group. Her behavior had changed subtly. She still led them to new locations, but her protective instincts appeared heightened. She often positioned herself between Richardson and the puppies, though she showed no outright aggression toward the archaeologist. She's been acting differently since the professor joined us, Martha observed privately to Frank. Animals have good instincts about people. Frank had noticed it too, but Richardson's expertise had proven invaluable. The archaeologist's ability to date and authenticate their finds gave legitimacy to what might otherwise seem like treasure hunting, and his suggestions about discreet sales to private collectors offered a solution to their mounting financial pressures. The moral complexity of their situation became clear during a heated discussion in Frank's living room. Dr. Mitchell argued for proper scientific protocol, insisting they report everything to state authorities. Bill Thompson, facing another pension cut, advocated for immediate sale of selected items to solve their most pressing financial needs. Dorothy Chen wavered between her natural honesty and her desperate need for money to help her son. Margaret always said that sometimes you have to choose between what's legal and what's right, Frank said quietly, surprising himself with the words. She believed in protecting things that mattered, but she also believed in helping people when you had the power to do so. Richardson listened to their debates with apparent sympathy, occasionally offering insights about the reality of archaeological bureaucracy. His stories of important discoveries languishing in state warehouses, while the discoverers received no recognition or compensation, resonated powerfully with people who'd watched their community's resources stripped away by distant authorities. I have contacts, he said eventually. Reputable collectors, museum acquisition committees, people who appreciate both the historical significance and the financial reality of discoveries like these. We could arrange discreet sales of selected items, enough to solve your immediate problems while preserving the most historically significant pieces for proper study. The proposal split the group. Martha and Dr. Mitchell remained uncomfortable with anything that bypassed official channels. Frank found himself genuinely torn between his respect for law and his practical understanding of their financial desperation. Bill Thompson and Dorothy Chen increasingly favored Richardson's approach. Bella's behavior became more pronounced during these discussions. She would pace restlessly when Richardson spoke, occasionally whining softly as if trying to communicate something urgent. Her puppies, now nearly 3 months old, seemed to mirror their mother's unease. "Maybe she's trying to tell us something," Frank suggested during one particularly tense evening. "She's led us this far. Maybe we should trust her instincts." Richardson smiled indulgently at the suggestion. "Animals are remarkably sensitive to emotional tension. She's probably just responding to the stress in the room." But Frank wasn't convinced. His bond with Bella had deepened over the weeks of exploration, and he'd learned to read her expressions with surprising accuracy. The dog who had fought a python to protect her puppies was trying to protect them from something else now. But from what? The answer would come sooner than any of them expected, and it would shatter everything they thought they knew about their archaeological adventure. The discovery that changed everything came on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in late October. Bella had been restless for days, pacing Frank's house at night and whining softly at windows that faced the forest. Her behavior had become so pronounced that Dr. Mitchell suggested bringing her back to the clinic for examination, but Bella showed no signs of physical distress, only an urgent need to return to the woods. "She's trying to tell us something," Frank insisted as the hiking group gathered despite the drizzling rain. "Look at her eyes. She's not confused or sick. She's determined." Martha bundled herself in her yellow rain slicker, watching Bella pace in tight circles near Frank's truck. "In 40 years of teaching, I learned to trust when someone was trying to communicate something important. Doesn't matter if they have 4 legs or 2. Dr. Richardson arrived 10 minutes late, his expensive outdoor gear pristine despite the weather. "Rough morning for hiking," he said with practiced concern. "Perhaps we should postpone until conditions improve." But Bella would not be deterred. The moment the group entered the forest, she set off with single-minded purpose, leading them deeper into the woods than they'd ever ventured. Her usual careful pace, accommodating for the elderly hikers, was replaced by barely contained urgency. The puppies, now strong enough for longer expeditions, struggled to keep up with their mother's determined stride. The path Bella chose wound through sections of old-growth forest that felt almost cathedral-like in their ancient majesty. Massive Douglas firs, some easily 300 years old, towered overhead, while the rain created a gentle percussion on the canopy above. Frank found himself thinking of Margaret, how she'd always said the forest held secrets that humans were too busy to notice. After nearly an hour of hiking, Bella stopped at the base of a granite outcropping that rose like a natural fortress from the forest floor. She paced back and forth, whining and pawing at what appeared to be a natural depression in the rock face. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than erosion patterns carved by centuries of weather. "I don't see anything," Bill Thompson said, his breath coming harder after the demanding hike. "Just rocks and more rocks." But Dr. Mitchell, whose veterinary training had taught her to notice subtle environmental changes, saw what Bella was indicating. "There," she said, pointing to the depression. "The vegetation pattern is different. See how the moss grows in that specific area? It's newer growth, like something was disturbed recently." Frank knelt beside Bella, running his hands along the rock face where she'd been pawing. His fingers found what his eyes had missed, artificial edges disguised by decades of natural camouflage. "This isn't natural erosion," he said, excitement growing in his voice. "Someone carved this. There's a space behind here." Richardson's demeanor shifted subtly, his academic interest sharpening into something more focused. "Fascinating. We'll need to be extremely careful with excavation. If there's a cavity behind that stone, we could be looking at a cache site, possibly the most significant find yet." The group worked together for 2 hours, carefully removing centuries of accumulated debris from what gradually revealed itself to be a deliberately constructed hiding place. The opening, when finally cleared, was just large enough for a person to crawl through, clearly designed for concealment rather than easy access. Frank volunteered to investigate first, his military training making him the logical choice for reconnaissance. Using his phone's flashlight, he squeezed through the narrow opening into a natural chamber carved from the granite formation. What he found inside made him forget to breathe. "Dear God," his voice echoed from within the chamber. "You need to see this. All of you." One by one, the group members crawled through the opening into a space that felt like stepping into a different century. The chamber was roughly the size of a small bedroom, its walls lined with wooden chests and metal containers that spoke of careful preservation over decades. But it was the sheer quantity of artifacts that stunned them into silence. Gold coins spilled from leather pouches like something from a pirate adventure. Ornate jewelry lay arranged in wooden boxes, the precious stones catching their flashlight beams and throwing rainbow reflections across the chamber walls. Religious artifacts, Crucifixes and ceremonial items suggested this was more than a simple treasure cache. This was a repository of incredible historical and financial value. "Conservative estimate," Richardson said, his voice carefully controlled as he examined the contents. "We're looking at $2 to $3 million in artifacts, possibly more depending on provenance and authentication." The silence that followed was deafening. Each group member grappled with the magnitude of what they'd discovered, wealth beyond anything they'd imagined, enough to solve every financial problem they faced, and more. Frank thought of the medical bills that had haunted him since Margaret's death. Dr. Mitchell calculated that this discovery could save her clinic and fund her father's legacy for generations. Dorothy Chen saw her son's rehabilitation fully paid for and a secure future beyond her wildest dreams. But it was Martha who voiced what they were all thinking. "This changes everything. We're not talking about a few $1,000s in artifacts anymore. This is life-changing money. The kind of money that makes people do things they never thought they'd do." Richardson nodded gravely. "The legal implications are significant. A find of this magnitude would trigger federal involvement, FBI, Department of Interior, possibly Homeland Security, given the potential foreign origins of some artifacts. The bureaucratic process could take years, and there's precedent for discoverers receiving minimal compensation while the government claims ownership." "What are our options?" Frank asked, though part of him already knew he wouldn't like any of the answers. "Officially, report everything immediately and hope for fair treatment from federal agencies," Richardson replied. "Unofficially, I have contacts who could handle discreet sales of selected items. Not everything. That would be too suspicious. But enough to secure your financial futures while ensuring the most historically significant pieces are preserved for proper study." The moral weight of the decision pressed down on them like the forest canopy above. These were people who'd lived their entire lives following rules, respecting authority, doing the right thing as they understood it. But they were also people who'd watched their community stripped of resources, their voices ignored by distant bureaucrats, their financial security evaporated by circumstances beyond their control. Bella's behavior throughout their time in the chamber had been increasingly agitated. She'd refused to fully enter the space, remaining near the entrance and whining softly. Her puppies, sensing their mother's distress, huddled against her flanks with obvious anxiety. "She doesn't like this place," Frank observed, watching Bella's nervous pacing. "She brought us here, but she doesn't want us to stay." "Animals sometimes react to enclosed spaces," Richardson explained dismissively. "Probably just claustrophobia or sensitivity to air circulation." But Frank had learned to trust Bella's instincts. The dog who'd led them to this incredible discovery was now clearly trying to tell them something else, something urgent and important that he couldn't quite understand. As they prepared to leave the chamber and return home to consider their options, Richardson made his proposal explicit. "I suggest we take a few days to think this through carefully. This kind of decision shouldn't be made hastily. I can research the legal precedents, contact my network of collectors and museum specialists, give you a clearer picture of all possibilities." "And in the meantime?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "In the meantime, we keep this discovery between us. No discussion with family, friends, or colleagues until we've decided on a course of action. The last thing we want is word of this getting out before we're prepared to handle the consequences." The group agreed, each member understanding the gravity of their situation. They'd stumbled into something far beyond their experience or expectations. The simple treasure hunt that had begun with Bella's mysterious behavior had evolved into a life-altering decision that would test everything they believed about right and wrong. As they sealed the chamber entrance and prepared for the long hike back to civilization, none of them noticed Richardson's satisfied smile or the way his fingers lingered on the GPS device that had recorded their exact location. The archaeologist's careful planning was finally paying off. He'd guided them perfectly to this moment. The moment when ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances would be forced to compromise their principles. Now, he just needed to give them a little more pressure to make the right choice. His choice. Frank helped Bella and her puppies over a fallen log, noting how the mother dog kept looking back toward the chamber with what could only be described as concern. Whatever Bella was trying to tell them, he sensed their time for listening was running out. The decision that would haunt Frank Miller for the rest of his life came on a Thursday evening, 3 days after the chamber discovery. The hiking group had gathered in his living room, the same space where Margaret had spent her final months reading historical novels and planning the garden she'd never lived to plant. The medical bills still sat on her desk, now dwarfed by the magnitude of what they'd found, but somehow more pressing than ever. "I've done the research you asked for," Dr. Richardson announced, spreading official-looking documents across Margaret's coffee table. "The legal precedents are not encouraging. In 1998, a family in Montana discovered Spanish colonial artifacts worth an estimated $4 million on public land. After 7 years of litigation, they received a settlement of $40,000, while the federal government claimed the rest." Martha Henderson studied the paperwork with the careful attention she'd once given to her students' assignments. The case files Richardson presented painted a consistent picture of discoverers being stripped of their finds by bureaucratic machinery designed to protect historical artifacts at the expense of the people who found them. "There's more," Richardson continued, his voice taking on the urgency Frank had learned to recognize. "I received word today that a geological survey team is scheduled to begin mapping this section of forest next month. Once they arrive, any discovery becomes automatically subject to federal oversight. Our window for making a decision is closing rapidly." Dr. Sarah Mitchell felt the walls of her professional ethics crumbling under the weight of practical reality. The foreclosure notice on her clinic had been followed by a second notice, this one final. She had 12 days to find $35,000 or lose everything her father had built. The modest salary offer from the corporate veterinary chain in Portland would barely cover her student loans, let alone allow her to maintain the community connections that gave her life meaning. "What exactly are you proposing?" Frank asked, though he already suspected the answer would force him to choose between his principles and his survival. Richardson leaned forward with the practiced intensity of someone accustomed to convincing others to take risks. "Selective recovery. We document everything thoroughly for historical preservation, but we quietly sell enough items to secure your financial futures. My contacts in the antiquities market are discreet, reputable people who appreciate both historical significance and fair compensation for discoverers." "You mean steal from a government site?" Martha said bluntly, her teacher's instinct for calling out euphemisms undimmed by age. "I mean, recover items that would otherwise disappear into government warehouses while the people who made the discovery lose their homes, their businesses, their futures," Richardson replied with heat. "The system is broken, Martha. Good people shouldn't have to suffer because bureaucrats care more about paperwork than human welfare." Bill Thompson, who'd remained silent through most of their meetings, finally spoke up. "My pension got cut again yesterday. 3rd time in 2 years. At this rate, I'll be working until I die, or living in my truck. You want to talk about what's right and wrong? What's wrong is a system that throws away people who've worked their whole lives." Dorothy Chen nodded agreement, her face drawn with worry about her son's deteriorating condition. The rehabilitation program had helped temporarily, but without long-term financial support, she knew he'd relapse again. The cycle of addiction and poverty that had claimed so many families in their community seemed inescapable without resources they simply didn't have. Frank found himself thinking about Margaret's final weeks when she'd insisted on rationing her pain medication to save money despite his protests. The memory of her suffering in silence rather than burden him with additional medical costs made his chest ache with renewed grief and rage at the unfairness of it all. "How would it work?" Dr. Mitchell asked quietly, her scientific training warring with her desperate circumstances. Richardson's presentation was thorough and convincing. They would remove only select items, pieces whose absence wouldn't be immediately obvious, but whose value could solve their most pressing problems. He had buyers lined up for specific types of artifacts, people who'd pay fair market value without asking uncomfortable questions about provenance. "The risk is minimal," he assured them. "My contacts operate in a legal gray area. Private collectors, small museums with acquisition budgets, people who appreciate historical artifacts and understand the complexities of discovery rights. Nothing goes to black market dealers or criminals." Bella had been restless throughout the meeting, pacing between the living room and the front door with obvious agitation. Her puppies, now old enough to mirror their mother's moods, whined softly from their corner bed. Frank noticed how Bella consistently positioned herself between Richardson and the rest of the group, as if trying to create a barrier. "She doesn't trust him," Frank said suddenly, the realization hitting him with surprising clarity. "Look at her body language. She's protective, but not toward us. She's protecting us from him." Richardson laughed dismissively. "Frank, with all due respect, you're anthropomorphizing normal animal behavior. Dogs react to stress and tension in their environment. She's responding to the emotional weight of your decision, not making judgments about my character." But Martha had noticed Bella's behavior too. 30 years of teaching had made her expert at reading nonverbal communication, whether from rebellious teenagers or anxious animals. Dogs who've been trained for law enforcement develop specific behavioral patterns around threats. I dated a K-9 officer for 2 years after my husband died. Bella's displaying classic protective positioning. The observation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Frank studied Richardson more carefully, noting details he'd overlooked in previous meetings, the expensive equipment that seemed inconsistent with independent researcher status, the way he always seemed to know exactly what arguments would be most persuasive, the practiced quality of his concern for their welfare. "Who are you really?" Frank asked, his military training finally overriding his desire to trust. Richardson's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. "I'm someone who understands that sometimes good people have to make difficult choices to survive in an unfair world. Someone who knows that noble principles don't pay medical bills or save family businesses." The truth, when it came, arrived with devastating suddenness. Richardson's phone rang, and in his haste to silence it, he accidentally answered on speaker. The voice that filled Frank's living room was gruff, impatient, and clearly criminal. "Richardson, you better have good news. My buyers are getting impatient, and if this deal falls through, you're going to have bigger problems than your gambling debts." The silence that followed was deafening. Richardson fumbled to end the call, but the damage was done. His carefully constructed facade crumbled as the group stared at him with dawning horror. "You son of a bitch," Bill Thompson said, his voice shaking with rage. "This whole thing was a setup. You've been playing us from the beginning." Richardson's desperation finally showed through completely. "Listen to me," he pleaded, dropping all pretense of academic authority. "Yes, I have debts. Yes, I need this deal to work. But that doesn't change the fact that you need money, too. We can still help each other." "Help each other?" Martha's teacher voice could have frozen water. "You manipulated a group of senior citizens into considering theft. You exploited our financial desperation for your own criminal purposes." Dr. Mitchell felt sick as the implications became clear. "The artifacts in the chamber. You put them there, didn't you? This whole discovery was staged." "Some of them," Richardson admitted, his academic composure completely gone. "But not all. There really is historical significance to this site. The Spanish artifacts are genuine, just relocated for easier discovery. Frank stood slowly, his military bearing returning as anger replaced confusion. "Get out of my house. Now!" "You don't understand," Richardson said, panic creeping into his voice. "My contacts aren't the kind of people you disappoint. If I don't deliver what I promised, they'll come looking for compensation. And they know about all of you now." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. These elderly people who'd thought they were embarking on a historical adventure had stumbled into something far more dangerous than they'd imagined. Richardson's gambling debts and criminal connections had made them all targets. Bella's agitation reached a crescendo as she began barking. Not the warning barks of a protective dog, but the desperate alarm calls of an animal sensing immediate danger. Through the living room window, Frank could see headlights turning into his driveway. "They're here," Richardson whispered, his face white with terror. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." The fairy tale was over. The nightmare was just beginning. The headlights in Frank's driveway belonged to two black SUVs that had no business in their quiet neighborhood. Through the living room curtains, the hiking group watched three men emerge from the vehicles, hard-faced individuals whose expensive suits couldn't disguise the predatory way they moved toward the house. "Back door," Frank commanded, his military training taking over despite his 68 years. "Everyone out the back door now." But Richardson blocked their path, his academic facade completely stripped away to reveal a man consumed by desperation and terror. "You don't understand," he said, grabbing Frank's arm. "These people don't accept failure. If I don't give them something valuable, they'll hurt everyone connected to this situation." "Including all of you." Martha Henderson pulled out her cell phone with trembling fingers, but Richardson knocked it from her hands before she could dial 911. The device shattered against the hardwood floor that Margaret had polished every Saturday for 43 years. "No police," Richardson hissed. "That will only make everything worse. My contacts have connections throughout the region. Calling the authorities will just confirm that we're not cooperating." The front door exploded inward without warning, splintering the frame that Frank had installed himself when he and Margaret first bought the house. Three men entered with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to intimidating others into compliance. The leader, a man in his 50s with silver hair and dead eyes, surveyed the group of elderly hikers with obvious contempt. "Dr. Richardson," he said, his voice carrying the flat menace of someone who'd never needed to raise it to get results. "I trust you have good news for us." "Vincent, please," Richardson stammered. "These people need more time to consider." "Time?" Vincent's laugh was like breaking glass. "You've had 6 months to deliver what you promised. 6 months while my buyers grew impatient and my investments went to other opportunities. Do you know what happens to people who waste my time?" Dr. Sarah Mitchell found her voice despite her terror. "We're just retirees who went hiking. We don't know anything about your business arrangements with Dr. Richardson." Vincent studied her with the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey. "Dr. Mitchell, owner of Mitchell Veterinary Clinic, current debt load approximately $40,000, facing foreclosure in 8 days. You know exactly what this is about, and you know exactly why you're going to cooperate." The precision of his knowledge about their personal finances sent ice through Frank's veins. These criminals had researched each member of their group, identified their vulnerabilities, prepared leverage for exactly this moment. "Frank Miller," Vincent continued, turning his attention to the group's unofficial leader. "Vietnam veteran, recently widowed, $40,000 in medical debt from his wife's cancer treatment. Martha Henderson, retired teacher, living on a pension that's been cut twice in 5 years. Bill Thompson, facing his 3rd pension reduction in 2 years. Dorothy Chen, son with a drug addiction that's cost her family their savings." Each revelation was a violation, proof that their privacy had been stripped away by people who treated human desperation as a commodity to be exploited. Bella's behavior had become increasingly agitated throughout the confrontation. The German Shepherd positioned herself between the intruders and her puppies, her lips pulled back in a silent snarl that spoke of barely controlled violence. Her training as a canine unit was evident in every line of her body. This was a dog bred and trained to fight dangerous people. "Interesting animal," Vincent observed, pulling a pistol from inside his jacket with casual indifference. "I assume it's attached to one of you?" "Don't," Frank said, stepping forward despite the weapon. "She's just protecting her puppies. She's not a threat to you." "Everything is a threat until I decide otherwise," Vincent replied. "Now, Dr. Richardson has promised us access to Spanish colonial artifacts worth approximately $2 million. We've invested considerable time and resources in this venture based on his assurances. I trust you understand that our investment requires protection." Richardson's collapse was complete now, the distinguished archaeologist reduced to a trembling man whose gambling addiction had led him to make promises to people who collected debts with violence. "The artifacts are real," he said desperately. "The location is confirmed. We just need to retrieve them from the cache site." "Then we'll retrieve them tonight," Vincent announced. "All of you will accompany us to ensure there are no misunderstandings about cooperation or loyalty." Martha found courage she didn't know she still possessed. "We're not going anywhere with you. We're American citizens with rights, and we don't have to—" Vincent's backhand sent the 70-year-old teacher sprawling across Frank's living room floor. The casual brutality of the attack shocked everyone into silence except Bella, whose growl escalated into a sound that raised the hair on everyone's necks. "Rights are for people who have the power to enforce them," Vincent said calmly. "You have no power here. You have no choices except the ones I give you." Frank knelt beside Martha, helping her sit up while blood trickled from her split lip. The sight of his neighbor, a woman who dedicated her life to teaching children and helping her community, bleeding on his floor, ignited something in Frank that he hadn't felt since Vietnam. "You made a mistake," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd seen violence up close and wasn't afraid of it. "You shouldn't have hit her," Vincent laughed. "Old man, you're 68 years old with arthritis and a heart condition. What exactly do you think you're going to do about it?" The answer came not from Frank, but from Bella. The German Shepherd's attack was precisely what her canine training had prepared her for, a calculated strike designed to neutralize an armed threat. 80 pounds of muscle and trained aggression hit Vincent before he could react, her jaws clamping onto his gun hand with the crushing force that had made her breed legendary among law enforcement. The pistol went flying as Vincent screamed, his professional composure shattered by unexpected pain and genuine fear. His two associates reached for their own weapons, but Frank was already moving with the speed and precision that had kept him alive in Southeast Asia 50 years ago. The combat was brief, but vicious. Frank's military training, dormant for decades, surged back with muscle memory that age couldn't erase. One attacker went down when Frank's elbow connected with his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and sending him crashing into Margaret's china cabinet. Dr. Mitchell, drawing on years of handling frightened animals, grabbed a heavy veterinary textbook and brought it down on the second attacker's skull with surprising force. The man collapsed in a heap beside the couch where the group had spent so many pleasant evenings discussing their archaeological discoveries. Vincent, meanwhile, was discovering why German Shepherds had been chosen for police and military work. Bella's grip on his arm was unbreakable, her training keeping her locked on to the threat until commanded to release. His screams filled the house that had been silent for too many months since Margaret's death. "Call 911, Frank commanded, adrenaline making him feel 20 years younger despite the chaos around him. "Call them now." But when Martha reached for the landline, she discovered the phone lines had been cut. The criminals had prepared for this contingency, isolating their victims from outside help. "Cell towers," Dr. Mitchell said, checking her phone. "They're jamming cell service somehow." The realization that they were truly isolated, miles from neighbors, cut off from communication, facing professional criminals who'd planned for resistance, settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. Vincent, his arm still trapped in Bella's jaws, managed to speak through gritted teeth. "You have no idea what you've done. My organization doesn't forgive attacks on its personnel. Even if you escape tonight, we'll find you. We'll find everyone you care about." Frank looked around his living room, at Martha bleeding but defiant, at Dr. Mitchell clutching her makeshift weapon, at Bill and Dorothy huddled together but refusing to surrender. These people had become his family in the months since Margaret's death, and now his decisions had put them all in mortal danger. But they weren't helpless victims anymore. They were survivors who'd just discovered they still had fight left in them. The battle for their lives was just beginning. But for the first time since the nightmare started, Frank felt something other than despair. He felt the cold satisfaction of a soldier who'd identified his enemy and chosen his ground. The question now was whether their courage would be enough to survive what was coming next. The path to salvation came from an unexpected source: Dr. Marcus Richardson's conscience, shattered by watching Martha Henderson's blood stain Frank Miller's hardwood floor. As Bella maintained her grip on Vincent's arm and the group secured the other two attackers with extension cords from Margaret's sewing room, Richardson made a confession that changed everything. "The artifacts," he said, his voice breaking with shame and desperation. "They're not Spanish colonial treasures. I planted them all over the past 3 months, using pieces from my personal collection and items I borrowed from various museums over the years." Frank looked up from where he was binding the unconscious attacker's hands, his face a mask of controlled fury. "You mean to tell us this entire nightmare was based on a lie?" "Not entirely," Richardson continued, tears streaming down his face as Vincent's screams provided a horrific soundtrack to his confession. "There really is something significant in that chamber, but it's not what any of us thought." Dr. Sarah Mitchell, still clutching the textbook she'd used as a weapon, demanded answers with the precision of someone whose scientific training demanded facts. "What's really in there, Marcus? What was worth putting all our lives at risk?" Richardson's explanation came in broken fragments as shock and guilt overwhelmed his academic composure. The chamber they'd discovered wasn't a Spanish treasure cache. It was something far more precious and far more dangerous. Hidden within the granite formation was a collection of documents and photographs that could destroy some of the most powerful families in Oregon. "My real name is Marcus Richland," he admitted. 30 years ago, I was an investigative journalist working on a story about illegal logging operations and political corruption in this region. I discovered evidence of environmental crimes, bribery, and cover-ups that reached the highest levels of state government." Martha, holding a towel to her bleeding lip, felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "You hid the evidence in the forest." "I had to," Richardson continued. "The people involved tried to kill me when they realized how much I'd uncovered. I faked my death, changed my identity, became Marcus Richardson, the archaeologist. But I never forgot where I'd hidden the real treasure, evidence that could still bring down a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for decades." The irony was devastating. They'd been manipulated into believing they were stealing historical artifacts when the real treasure was justice, evidence that could expose the very corruption that had been strangling their community for years. Vincent, despite his pain, began laughing, a sound more terrifying than his earlier threats. "You idiots have no idea what you're dealing with. Those documents implicate people who make me look like a church deacon. If that evidence surfaces, half the state government will fall." Frank felt Margaret's presence strongly in that moment, remembering her passion for environmental protection and her fury at the corporate interests that had clear-cut their region's forests without regard for consequences. His wife had spent years fighting the same corruption that Richardson had tried to expose 30 years ago. "We're going to that chamber," Frank announced with military decisiveness. "We're retrieving those documents and we're making sure they reach the right people." But Vincent's organization had prepared for multiple contingencies. Even as Frank spoke, the sound of additional vehicles approaching the house made everyone freeze. Through the windows, they could see more SUVs surrounding the property, backup forces that had been waiting for a signal that never came. Dr. Mitchell realized their situation with clinical clarity. "We're trapped. Even if we could get to the forest, they'll follow us. And if they get those documents, then 30 years of murder and environmental destruction continues," Richardson finished, "and everyone who's died to keep those secrets will have died for nothing." Bella finally released Vincent's arm at Frank's command, but remained in protective position near her puppies. The German Shepherd's training told her the immediate threat had been neutralized, but her instincts warned of greater dangers approaching. It was Martha who provided the solution that would define their legacy. Despite her age and injury, the retired teacher's mind worked with the clarity that had made her beloved by generations of students. "We don't all go to the chamber," she said. "Some of us create a distraction, while others retrieve the evidence." Classic misdirection. I used it for 30 years to manage unruly teenagers. Frank understood immediately. Military diversionary tactics. Split their forces, confuse their objectives. The plan they developed in those desperate minutes was born from their diverse expertise and strengthened by their newfound family bonds. Dr. Mitchell would remain at the house with Dorothy and Bill, using her medical knowledge to treat their prisoners and maintain the fiction that everyone was still there. Martha and Frank would take Richardson to the forest chamber, counting on his knowledge of the hidden evidence to guide them. Bella would come with them, not as a pet, but as the trained canine officer she'd once been, their guardian and protector in the dangerous hours ahead. "If we don't make it back," Frank told Dr. Mitchell, gripping her hands with surprising gentleness, "you call every news station, every FBI office, every environmental group you can find. Tell them to look for the evidence Richardson hid 30 years ago. Tell them Margaret Miller's husband died trying to finish what she started." The escape from the house was harrowing. Frank's knowledge of the local terrain, gained from decades of Forest Service work, allowed them to slip through the woods behind his property, while Vincent's reinforcements concentrated on the front approaches. Richardson, despite his terror and guilt, proved valuable as a guide. His years of hiding in academic life hadn't erased his journalist's instincts for moving unseen. Bella led the way with the confidence of an animal who knew every trail, every hiding place, every safe passage through the forest that had become her domain. Her puppies remained behind with Dr. Mitchell, a sacrifice that clearly pained the mother dog, but which she accepted with the discipline of her training. The journey to the chamber took 2 hours through treacherous terrain made more dangerous by darkness and the constant threat of pursuit. When they finally reached the granite outcropping, Frank realized that everything about their previous visits had been orchestrated by Richardson to hide the true nature of what lay hidden there. "The real entrance isn't the one we used before," Richardson admitted as they approached the rock formation. "I sealed the original access point 30 years ago and created a false chamber with planted artifacts to throw off anyone who might stumble across the site." The true repository lay deeper within the granite formation, accessible only through a passage so narrow and well concealed that Richardson needed 20 minutes to locate it despite having created it himself decades earlier. Inside the authentic chamber, Frank's flashlight revealed not gold and jewels, but something far more valuable: file cabinets filled with documents, photographs, and recorded testimonies that told the story of systematic environmental destruction and political corruption spanning 3 decades. These papers, Richardson explained as they worked frantically to gather the most crucial evidence, prove that the logging companies, state officials, and federal regulators conspired to destroy over 200,000 acres of old-growth forest. They show bribes, forged environmental impact studies, and cover-ups of species extinction. Martha, despite her age and exhaustion, understood the magnitude of what they'd found. This is why they killed people to keep it secret. This isn't just criminal, it's genocide against the forest itself. As they prepared to leave with the evidence that could finally bring justice to their region, the sound of approaching voices told them Vincent's people had tracked them down. The final confrontation would take place here, in the chamber where truth had waited 30 years for champions brave enough to carry it into the light. But they were no longer the frightened retirees who'd stumbled into this nightmare. They were protectors of something larger than themselves, guardians of justice, environmental stewards, and the living embodiment of Margaret Miller's belief that ordinary people could change the world when they found the courage to stand together. The battle for their community's future was about to begin, and Frank Miller felt his wife's spirit guiding him as he prepared to fight the most important fight of his life. Behind them, Bella's howl echoed through the chamber, not a cry of distress, but a call to battle that seemed to awaken the very forest itself. The final chapter of their story would determine whether decades of corruption would continue, or whether an elderly hiking group and a mother dog's fierce loyalty would finally bring the truth to light. The darkness was ending. Dawn was coming. In the end, salvation came not from the evidence they'd risked everything to retrieve, but from the bonds they'd forged in the crucible of shared danger. As Vincent's men closed in on the granite chamber, Frank Miller made a decision that would have made Margaret proud. He chose family over treasure, love over legacy, and the living over the dead. "We're not doing this for documents or justice or any grand cause," he told Martha and Richardson as they heard footsteps approaching through the forest darkness. "We're doing this because we found each other when we all thought we were lost." The confrontation, when it came, was swift and decisive. Vincent himself led the assault on the chamber, his wounded arm testament to Bella's fierce protection. But the criminal who'd terrorized them in Frank's living room was unprepared for what he found in the forest. Not cowering seniors hiding in a cave, but a family united by purpose and protected by a dog whose loyalty transcended species. Bella's attack this time was not defensive, but strategic. Her canine training had taught her to work with human partners, and she understood instinctively that Frank needed time to act. Her assault on Vincent created the opening Frank needed to use the combat skills that had kept him alive in Vietnam 50 years earlier. But it was Martha who ended the threat permanently. The retired teacher who'd spent her career nurturing young minds proved she still had the strength to protect those she loved. Her hiking pole, driven with the precision of someone who'd once coached the high school softball team, found its mark with devastating effectiveness. When the Oregon State Police finally arrived, summoned by Dr. Mitchell's eventually successful 911 call, they found a scene that would become legendary in law enforcement circles. 6 senior citizens and a German shepherd had not only survived an attack by organized criminals, but had systematically dismantled a corruption network that had plagued the Pacific Northwest for 3 decades. The documents Richardson had hidden proved to be even more significant than anyone had imagined. The evidence led to indictments of 14 public officials, the dissolution of 3 major logging corporations, and the creation of the Margaret Miller Memorial Environmental Preserve, 200,000 acres of protected forest that would ensure future generations could experience the wilderness that had brought their unlikely family together. Frank's medical debt disappeared when a grateful state awarded him a substantial finder's fee for exposing the corruption. Dr. Mitchell's clinic not only survived but expanded into a regional wildlife rehabilitation center. Dorothy Chen's son entered a fully funded treatment program that addressed both his addiction and the underlying depression that had fueled it. Bill Thompson discovered that his pension had been deliberately underfunded by the same officials whose corruption they'd exposed. The restored funds allowed him to retire with dignity, but the real treasure they'd found had nothing to do with money or justice or environmental protection. It was the discovery that families could be chosen as well as born, that purpose could be found at any age, and that love, whether between humans or between species, was the only currency that truly mattered. Dr. Marcus Richardson, whose deception had nearly destroyed them all, found redemption in an unexpected place. The criminal charges against him were dropped in exchange for his testimony, but more importantly, his estranged daughter Emma reached out after seeing news coverage of their adventure. The reunion between father and daughter took place in Frank's living room, where so many other healing moments had occurred. "I spent 30 years running from the truth," Richardson told Frank during one of their weekly coffee meetings. "You taught me that the only way to escape the past is to face it with people who care about your future." Bella's story had the happiest ending of all. The German shepherd who'd lived wild in the forest, protecting her territory and raising her puppies alone, became the heart of a new family that spanned generations and species. Her 3 puppies grew into magnificent dogs who served as therapy animals throughout their community, but Bella herself remained with Frank, his constant companion and living reminder that loyalty was always rewarded, even when it seemed hopeless. The chamber in the granite formation became a shrine of sorts, visited by environmental groups and history students who wanted to understand how ordinary citizens had exposed extraordinary corruption. But Frank preferred to remember it as the place where he'd learned that Margaret's spirit lived on in every act of courage, every gesture of protection, every moment when someone chose to stand up for what was right. On quiet evenings, Frank would sit on his porch with Bella at his feet, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold while her grown puppies played with the neighborhood children who'd adopted them as unofficial guardians. The medical bills were gone from Margaret's desk, replaced by letters from environmental groups, thank you cards from families whose lives had been changed by their courage, and photographs of the hiking group at various celebrations and reunions. Martha had framed her favorite picture from their adventure, not one of the dramatic rescue scenes or the moment of triumph, but a quiet image of Bella leading them through dappled forest light, her tail high with confidence, her eyes bright with purpose. "She always knew where we needed to go," Martha would tell visitors. "We just had to trust her enough to follow." The hiking group still met every Tuesday morning, though their destinations had expanded beyond Cascade Forest to include speaking engagements at senior centers, environmental conferences, and community groups across the Pacific Northwest. Their story had become a touchstone for people who believed that age was no barrier to adventure, that corruption could be defeated by ordinary citizens, and that the bonds forged in crisis were often stronger than those formed in comfort. Dr. Mitchell kept a special place in her clinic for injured wildlife, funded by donations from people inspired by their story. The wall of her office displayed dozens of photographs, recovering animals, successful releases, and families reunited with lost pets. But the centerpiece was a portrait of Bella with her puppies, taken the day after their rescue, when none of them knew they were about to embark on the adventure of their lifetimes. As Frank reflected on the journey that had transformed them all from isolated individuals into an unbreakable family, he often thought about the morning when Bella's desperate howls had pierced the forest silence. They'd thought they were rescuing a dog, but the truth was more profound. She'd been rescuing them. And the lesson Bella had taught them was simple but revolutionary. Loyalty wasn't about gratitude or obligation or even love in its conventional sense. True loyalty was about recognizing when someone needed protection and having the courage to provide it, regardless of the cost. It was about leading people to safety even when the path was dangerous, about fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, about believing that family was defined by choice rather than blood. In the end, the treasure they'd sought was the treasure they'd become, not a collection of artifacts or documents or monetary rewards, but a living testament to the power of connection across species, across generations, across the artificial barriers that too often kept people isolated in their pain. Frank Miller had learned that Margaret's greatest gift to him wasn't their 43 years of marriage, precious as those had been. Her greatest gift was teaching him that love didn't end with death. It transformed, finding new expressions in unexpected places, guiding him toward the family he never knew he needed. And Bella, the German shepherd who'd fought a python to protect her babies and led a group of strangers to find their purpose, had shown them all that sometimes the greatest treasures were hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to follow where love and loyalty led. The forest still held its secrets, but the most important ones had been revealed. That courage could bloom at any age, that families could be formed in the most unlikely circumstances, and that the bond between humans and animals was one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Their story had ended where all the best stories do, not with an ending, but with a beginning, a message for our community. Friends, this story reminds us that our greatest adventures often begin when we think our best years are behind us. Frank, Martha, and their companions discovered that at 60, 65, and beyond, they still had the courage to fight for what mattered, the strength to protect those they loved, and the wisdom to recognize that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the depth of our connections. How many of us have felt invisible or forgotten in a world that celebrates youth? Yet here we see that experience, determination, and the willingness to stand together can overcome any obstacle. The bond between Bella and her human family proves that love transcends species, age, and circumstance. It's never too late to find your pack, to discover your purpose, or to become the hero in someone else's story. Share your thoughts. What unexpected friendship or adventure has brought the most meaning to your later years? Have you ever felt called to protect someone or something important, even when it seemed beyond your capabilities?